Hi there, welcome back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. Elena sat at her desk, surrounded by an ocean of crumpled paper. The flickering of the fluorescent lights above did little to calm her. Her fingers, still trembling, hovered over the math test she had just received. Red ink smeared across the paper in harsh, unforgiving lines. She had failed again. She could hear the echoes of her teacher's words from earlier that day. Maybe math just isn't for you. Each time she heard them, it felt like they dug a little deeper, like tiny daggers that left wounds she wasn't sure she could heal. Her heart sank into her stomach. She wasn't angry, not at her teacher, not at the test, but at herself. Every day she fought with the numbers. They twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, no matter how hard she tried to understand. Elena had been trying since she was 10, and she had failed every single time. The constant struggle weighed on her shoulders, and it wasn't just the frustration of not getting it right, it was the feeling of being left behind. As a child, math had always seemed like a mountain she could never scale. In elementary school, she had been placed in advanced classes, and while her friends sailed through, Elena struggled to keep up. The faster pace, the constant pressure to understand, left her feeling isolated. Her classmates would finish assignments in a fraction of the time it took her. They'd laugh and joke, while Elena would sit quietly in the back, pretending that it didn't bother her. But it did. It always did. At home, things weren't much better. Her mother, a single parent, did her best to support Elena. She encouraged her to keep going, to keep pushing forward, but Elena couldn't help but feel like a failure. Her mother would spend hours sitting with her at the kitchen table, helping with homework, explaining fractions and equations in gentle tones. But no matter how many times she explained it, Elena couldn't seem to grasp it. It was as though math was a language that her mind refused to speak. In high school, things only grew harder. The stakes were higher. Elena's grades dipped. The whispers from her classmates grew louder. She heard the mockery in their voices when they noticed she still couldn't solve the simplest problems. "She'll never make it," they'd say, their eyes following her as she walked into the classroom. "Math's just not her thing." And the worst part? Elena began to believe them, but then something happened. It wasn't immediate, nor was it a grand moment of revelation. It started with a question, one simple question that Elena had been too afraid to ask before. "Can you help me understand this, Mr. Allen?" It was a question she had never dared to ask in all her years of struggling. For the first time, Elena asked for help. Mr. Allen had paused, his eyes softening when he looked at her. "Of course, Elena. Let's work through it together." It wasn't a magical moment. She didn't suddenly understand everything. But something inside her shifted. It wasn't about suddenly becoming great at math. It was about giving herself permission to try, to ask for help, to not be ashamed of her struggles. Eleanor realized that she didn't have to know everything right away. She didn't have to be perfect. She just had to keep moving forward, step by step, even if those steps were small and uncertain. As the weeks passed, Elena found herself going back to Mr. Allen's desk, asking more questions, trying harder, and letting go of the expectation that she had to get everything perfect. It was liberating, in a way. She began to see math not as a mountain to climb, but as a puzzle to solve. and while it still didn't make sense all the time, she could feel herself understanding more than she ever had before. Slowly, piece by piece, the fog began to clear. The test results still haunted her. But each time she saw a failing grade, she reminded herself failure wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of another try. She didn't know yet how it would happen, or if it would happen at all, but Elena was determined. She would keep going, and that, perhaps, was the first step toward something greater. The months slipped by like pages turning in a book that Elena had yet to finish reading. Every test felt like another mountain to scale, and each grade, though slightly better, was still a reminder of how far she had to go. But with every failure, something inside her hardened, a quiet determination, an understanding that she wasn't just fighting numbers, but fighting the narrative that had been written for her long ago. Elena wasn't the girl who failed math. She was the girl who kept trying. Her classmates didn't know how she felt. To them, she was the quiet girl at the back of the room, the one who never raised her hand, and who always seemed just a little out of place. But beneath that stillness was a mind that was starting to work differently. Elena didn't care about fitting in anymore. She didn't need the approval of others to keep going. What mattered was that she was learning, slowly. Surely it was. Winter, when Elena first thought about her future again. She had spent so much time trying to survive the present that she hadn't considered what came next. But one evening, while sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of notes in front of her, she looked up at her mother. "I think I want to be an engineer," Elena said, her voice quiet but firm. Her mother, who had always supported her, didn't blink. "An engineer? That's a big dream, honey. Are you sure?" Elena nodded. "I don't know how to do it yet, but I know I can." Her mother smiled softly, as if she understood more than Elena had said. "You've always been good with your hands, and your mind works differently than other people's. You'll find your way." For the first time, Elena didn't feel the weight of doubt that had always followed her. The idea of becoming an engineer had seemed ridiculous when she was younger, too far out of reach, especially given how math had always been her weakness. But now, something in her was different. The failure didn't define her. The struggle was just part of the process. Elena began to study with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just doing it to pass the next test anymore. She was doing it because she wanted to learn, because she wanted to understand how things worked, how machines were built, and how problems could be solved. She still struggled. Math was still hard. But now it wasn't a barrier. It was a challenge that she could meet, one small step at a time. Her mother's support became her anchor, her constant reminder that she wasn't alone. Every time Elena doubted herself, her mother was there to remind her that persistence was more powerful than talent. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to keep trying. In the small moments of doubt, Elena remembered her mother's words. It wasn't about being the best at math. It was about never giving up. Every failed test became a lesson, and every failure a building block. One afternoon, as Elena sat in the library, surrounded by piles of books, she felt a sense of quiet confidence settle over her. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was there, a sense of calm understanding that no matter how many times she fell, she would rise again. She wasn't looking for immediate success anymore. She was learning to value the process. The failures, the small victories, and then, as if the universe was rewarding her persistence, Elena passed her math test. It wasn't a perfect score, but it was a pass. It was proof that all her work, all her effort had paid off. It wasn't just about solving equations. It was about the quiet moments of perseverance, about sitting with frustration until it faded into understanding, about believing that there was something waiting for her, even when the path was unclear. It wasn't the end, far from it, but it was a milestone, a small victory that proved to her that she could do it, and with that, Elena finally allowed herself to believe something she had never dared to believe before, that she was capable of becoming the engineer she had always dreamed of. Elena's first day at the community college felt like a quiet kind of victory. It was different from the intimidating, grand campuses of the larger universities she had once dreamed of attending. The classrooms were smaller, the professors more accessible, and the other students more like her, people who had stumbled, who had taken detours, but who had found their way here nonetheless. She sat in her first engineering class, the lecture hall buzzing with quiet chatter. Elena's palms were sweaty, her heart beating faster than usual. The faces around her seemed so confident, so sure of what they were doing. But Elena wasn't sure. She wasn't sure about anything anymore. The rejection letters still stung, and the doubts lingered in the back of her mind, whispering that maybe she wasn't good enough after all. But as the professor began speaking, something clicked. For the first time, she could see the patterns, the way equations tied together. She understood the basic concepts more than she had in high school, and even though the material was still challenging, Elena felt a spark of excitement deep in her chest. This was what she had wanted, to understand, to connect the dots. She couldn't explain it to anyone, but sitting in that room, surrounded by others who had their own struggles and their own goals, Elena realized that she wasn't just trying to be good at math. She was trying to build something, to create something that would last. It wasn't about mastering formulas or solving problems for the sake of passing a test. It was about learning to think differently, about seeing problems as opportunities, not obstacles. The first few weeks were rough, as she struggled to adjust to the pace of the program. The coursework was dense and the problems were complex. But this time, Elena didn't panic. She embraced the challenge. She met with professors. After class, worked through problems with her peers and stayed up late into the night, poring over notes. It wasn't easy. It wasn't glamorous. But it was progress. Each equation solved, each theory understood, felt like a small victory. And then came the first project. It was a simple one. Build a basic machine that could demonstrate a simple principle of physics. Elena wasn't sure what to expect. Her skills were still shaky, and she had never worked with such hands-on projects before. The other students seemed to know exactly what they were doing, but Elena felt lost. Her mind raced as she tried to put together the pieces, but nothing seemed to work. She struggled, failed, and had to start over again and again. It was frustrating. It was painful. It felt like everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. But then, as she sat in front of her half-finished project, late one night, Elena had a moment of clarity. She looked at the pieces in front of her, not as failures, but as experiments. She wasn't expected to get everything perfect the first time. She wasn't supposed to be flawless. What mattered was that she kept going. With newfound determination, Elena took a step back and approached the project differently. She broke it down into smaller steps, rethinking her approach and seeking advice from her classmates. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was progress. And when the project was finally complete, standing on her desk, working as it was supposed to, Elena felt an immense sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the machine that mattered most. It was the journey she had taken to build it. For the first time in a long while, Elena smiled. She hadn't just passed a test or finished a project. She had learned. She had grown. And in that growth, she felt something shift deep inside her. Something that would carry her through the rest of her journey. The road ahead would still be difficult. There would be more failures, more doubts, more setbacks. But Elena understood now. It wasn't about avoiding failure. It was about learning to rise after each fall, and about knowing that with every step forward, she was closer to her goal. The mountain didn't feel so tall anymore. As the semester progressed, Elena's confidence began to grow. The early struggles with the material had not disappeared, but they were no longer a source of defeat. Instead, they had become challenges she knew she could face. She spent hours in the lab, carefully experimenting with her ideas, adjusting components, and testing her theories. With each experiment, there were more moments of failure, but each failure carried the knowledge of what didn't work, and that was just as important as what did. Her classmates, who had once seemed like giants in the field, now appeared more like companions on the same journey. Elena didn't need to compete with them anymore. She didn't need to be better. She just needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time. It was a lesson that would serve her for the rest of her career. The goal wasn't to be perfect. It was to keep improving, to never stop learning. One of the most pivotal moments of Elena's time in the program came unexpectedly during a late-night study session. She was in the lab, trying to piece together the components of a more advanced machine. She had been working for hours, and the exhaustion was starting to cloud her focus. It seemed like no matter how many times she rechecked her calculations, the machine would not come together. The frustration built inside her, threatening to break her resolve. Just as she was about to give up, she heard a soft knock on the door. It was Professor Harris, one of the most respected faculty members in the engineering department. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, his voice warm and friendly. Elena hesitated, but then nodded. "I can't seem to get it right," she said, the weight of failure hanging heavy in her voice. Professor Harris leaned over her workbench and examined the components. He didn't immediately offer advice. Instead, he stood silently for a moment, taking in the entire setup. Then he turned to Elena with a knowing smile. "It's not about getting everything perfect right now," he said. "Engineering isn't about flawless execution at the first try. It's about persistence and adaptability, and sometimes you have to let go of your expectations to see what works." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time, she realized that the pressure to be perfect wasn't just her burden. It was something that every engineer dealt with. The fear of failure, the desire to get everything right, could paralyze even the most seasoned professionals. But the key wasn't to eliminate those fears. It was to learn how to push through them. Over the next few weeks, Elena adopted a new mindset. She stopped trying to control every detail to make everything perfect. Instead, she embraced the unknown, welcomed the mistakes, and found new ways to approach each problem. When things didn't work, she viewed it not as a sign of her inability, but as a valuable learning experience. She had learned to see failure as just another step in the process, not a sign that she was unworthy. The next project was one of the most challenging Elena had ever faced: designing a sustainable energy system for a small community. The stakes were high and there was little room for error. But this time she approached it differently. She broke the project into smaller tasks, researched extensively, collaborated with her peers, and applied everything she had learned. She wasn't concerned about getting everything right the first time. Instead, she focused on the process, on learning and growing with every phase. The day the project was completed, Elena stood back and surveyed the results. The system worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. And that was enough. It was proof of her growth, her ability to adapt and learn, and her willingness to push through the challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. She had built something real, something tangible, and that feeling of creating something that mattered was worth more than any grade or any accolade. It wasn't a final victory. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more obstacles. But for the first time, Elena understood that those obstacles weren't barriers. They were part of the journey. Every challenge she faced, every mistake she made, was an opportunity to grow. And that was the foundation upon which her future would be built. As Elena's college years wore on, she found herself diving deeper into the complexities of engineering. The projects grew larger, the theories more intricate, and the deadlines tighter. The learning curve was steep, and the pressure never seemed to let up. But Elena had learned to handle it. She had learned to work through the discomfort, to embrace the long nights, and to keep going even when things seemed impossible. She still had moments of doubt, moments when the fear of failure would creep in. But now, those moments didn't paralyze her. Instead, they fueled her determination. Elena had realized that the fear she once felt about failing was no longer a barrier. It was a signal that she was pushing herself to grow, and that was the most important thing. One day, after a particularly tough week, Elena was sitting in the library, sipping coffee and staring blankly at her notes. The week had been filled with project after project, each more demanding than the last, and the exhaustion was beginning to catch up with her. Her mind wandered back to the first time she'd felt this way, back when she was still struggling to pass basic math tests. She remembered the discouragement, the sense of being overwhelmed by the sheer size of her goals. But now, looking at her notes, she realized how far she had come. She had struggled, yes, but she had learned. She had fought for each victory, each breakthrough, and in the process, she had found a strength inside herself that she hadn't known was there. A sudden thought struck her. She was ready to face the world outside the classroom, ready to take on the real challenges that awaited her in the field. She wasn't sure what that would look like yet, whether it would be a large corporation or a startup, or if she would eventually start her own company, but she knew she was capable. And that realization, that quiet confidence, was a game changer. Weeks, Later, Elena found herself at a career fair, standing at a booth for one of the top engineering firms in the country. The representatives there were polished, confident, and seemingly flawless. They had been recruiting from top universities, speaking to the most promising students in the field. Elena wasn't sure what she was doing there. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she approached one of the recruiters, a sharp-dressed woman who looked as though she could spot a mistake a mile away. But Elena wasn't about to let the old fears take hold. She had worked too hard to turn back now. "Hi," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves. "I'm Elena. I'm studying engineering, and I'm really interested in your company." The recruiter looked up from the brochure she was holding, sizing Elena up with a practiced glance. "Tell me about a project you've worked on that you're particularly proud of." Elena hesitated for a moment. The pressure to impress was intense, but she didn't try to craft a perfect answer. She just spoke from the heart, describing the sustainable energy system she had designed, and explaining how it had been a challenge every step of the way, but how it had taught her the value of persistence, teamwork, and adaptability. The recruiter seemed interested, nodding as Elena spoke. "That sounds like a solid project, but what sets you apart from others who are vying for the same opportunities?" Elena paused. She didn't have the perfect answer. She wasn't the best student in her class, nor did she have the flashiest resume. But she did know one thing. She had learned to keep going. She had learned to embrace the challenges, to face them head on instead of running from them. "I think what sets me apart is my ability to keep learning," Elena said, her voice gaining strength. "I've failed, I've made mistakes, but I've learned from all of them. I'm not afraid to face the hard problems. I'm not afraid of failure anymore. I know how to work through it and come out stronger." The recruiter didn't smile, but there was a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "That's a quality we value here. Keep in touch." Elena left the booth with her heart racing, but it wasn't fear that was making it beat fast. It was the rush of realizing that she had just faced a significant challenge and had come through it. The fear that used to stop her was now just a faint whisper in the back of her mind. She had learned to quiet it, to drown it out with the knowledge that she was capable. The rest of the career fair was a blur. Elena spoke to a few more companies, but the conversations felt different. She wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't anymore. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She was just herself, and that was enough. After the career fair, Elena felt a shift within herself. The world of engineering had never felt so vast, yet so familiar. Her vision for the future was no longer clouded by uncertainty or fear. She had seen, for the first time, how much she had changed, how far she had come. The girl who once dreaded failure, who doubted her ability to even pass a math test, was now standing at the threshold of her dreams. Weeks later, Elena received an email from one of the companies she had spoken to at the fair. It was an internship offer. The excitement that shot through her veins was almost overwhelming. She had done it. Despite the odds, despite the doubts that had once threatened to cripple her, she had made it. Her first day at the company was surreal. The office was sleek and modern, filled with cutting-edge technology and teams of engineers deep in discussion. Elena walked through the halls, trying to act as if this were just another day, but inside she could barely contain the mixture of nervousness and pride bubbling up. As she was introduced to her team, Elena couldn't help but notice how they seemed to have their act together. They were so confident, so sure of themselves, moving from one task to the next with ease. She felt like an outsider. She didn't belong here, at least, not yet. Her manager, Rachel, was the first to notice her discomfort. It's normal to feel like an outsider when you're new. Just take it one step at a time and don't be afraid to ask questions. You're here because you've already shown you have what it takes. Elena nodded, but doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Could she really do this? Could she really prove herself among such experienced engineers? The thought of failing again, of not measuring up, gnawed at her. But she had learned, over the years, that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about pushing through the discomfort, about showing up every day, doing the work, and learning from each experience. The first few weeks were challenging. Elena found herself struggling with tasks that the other interns seemed to handle effortlessly. She would spend hours on a problem, only to find that the solution was something simple she had overlooked. She had to work harder than ever before just to keep up. And each time she felt like she had caught up, a new challenge would appear, pushing her back to square one. But this time, Elena wasn't discouraged. She didn't give in to the old urge to quit, to walk away from the challenge before it could break her. Instead, she stayed late, asked more questions, and kept refining her skills. She had learned the value of persistence, of patience. She understood now that true success wasn't found in a single moment of triumph. It was in the day-to-day commitment to growth, to showing up and doing the work, even when things felt overwhelming. One afternoon, Elena found herself facing a particularly tricky problem. The team had been working for weeks on a new software update for a piece of machinery, but the system kept malfunctioning. Everyone else seemed stumped, including Rachel, the manager. Elena watched as the team members exchanged frustrated looks, each one of them trying different angles, but getting nowhere. For a brief moment, Elena considered stepping back. The others were more experienced. They had the answers. They were supposed to be the ones to figure it out. But something inside her shifted. She had worked through problems like this before, and maybe, just maybe, she could bring a fresh perspective to the table. With a deep breath, Elena approached her manager. "I have an idea," she said, her voice a little shaky, but determined. Rachel raised an eyebrow but gestured for Elena to continue. "Go ahead." Elena explained her thoughts, an adjustment to the software that would allow it to process data differently, which she believed could resolve the issue. Rachel listened carefully, then turned to the rest of the team. After a few moments of discussion, they decided to give it a try. The hours stretched on as the team worked together to implement Elena's suggestion. The tension in the room was palpable. And then, suddenly, it happened. The system clicked. The malfunction that had plagued them for weeks disappeared. The room erupted in excitement, and Elena stood there, almost in disbelief. It wasn't just that her solution had worked. It was that she had taken a leap of faith, that she had trusted herself enough to share her idea, even when it felt like she didn't belong. Rachel looked at her, a genuine smile crossing her face. "Well done, Elena. You brought a new perspective to the table." In that moment, Elena understood something profound. She wasn't just an intern. She wasn't just someone who had failed a million times. She was a problem solver, a thinker, a contributor. She had found her place in the world not because she was perfect, but because she was willing to learn, to try, and to keep moving forward, no matter how many times she stumbled along the way. After the success of that project, Elena began to see herself in a new light. The doubt that had always followed her, the fear of not being good enough, started to fade into the background. It wasn't that the fear was gone entirely, but she had learned to use it, to channel it into determination instead of letting it hold her back. As the internship progressed, Elena took on more responsibilities. She was no longer just observing or assisting, she was actively contributing, solving problems, and developing new ideas. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of frustration, moments when the work didn't come out as expected or when her solutions didn't fit the way she imagined. But she had learned the invaluable skill of persistence. She had learned to face her fears head on. Elena's colleagues started to notice the change in her as well. She was no longer just the quiet intern in the corner, but a strong and capable member of the team. Her ideas began to carry weight in meetings. Her input was valued. And while she was still far from knowing everything, Elena had learned that her worth didn't come from having all the answers. It came from her willingness to seek them, to challenge herself, and to keep learning. One evening, as Elena was walking out of the office, Rachel called her into her office. There was a serious tone in her voice, one that Elena hadn't heard before. Elena, I wanted to talk to you about something important," Rachel began. "We've been really impressed with your progress here. You've grown so much in a short amount of time. I think you're ready for something bigger." Elena's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the moment she had been waiting for? Rachel continued, "We have an opening for a lead role in the next big project we're taking on, and I want you to consider applying for it." Elena was stunned. The thought of being in charge of a major project, leading a team of engineers, was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had just started to feel comfortable in her position. She had only begun to trust herself. How could she possibly take on such a large responsibility? "I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm ready for a—" "Something like that," Elena replied, her voice unsure. Rachel smiled as though she had been expecting that answer. "I've been in this field for a long time. The truth is, you'll never feel fully ready. But that's where the growth happens. You don't have to know everything. You just have to be willing to learn, to guide others, and to take risks. I've seen the way you approach problems. You're ready for this. I believe in you." Elena sat there in silence for a moment, her mind racing. She wasn't sure if she could do it. What if she failed? What if her team didn't respect her? But then another thought surfaced. What if this was the opportunity she had been waiting for? What if this was the moment that could change everything? "I'll do it," Elena finally said, her voice steady. "I'll apply for the role." The decision was a turning point for Elena. It wasn't just about the job, the title, or the recognition. It was about embracing the challenge, facing the fear, and stepping into a role that forced her to grow. It was about trusting that she could handle it, even if she didn't have all the answers. The weeks that followed were some of the most intense of Elena's career. As the lead on the new project, She was responsible for guiding her team through every stage, from the initial concept to the final implementation. It was a huge undertaking, and there were moments when the weight of the responsibility felt unbearable. But Elena had learned how to manage pressure, how to break problems down into smaller tasks, how to keep pushing forward when the path seemed unclear. There were setbacks, of course. A few design ideas didn't work as planned. Some of her team members clashed over certain approaches. Elena's own doubts crept in at times, especially when things weren't going as smoothly as she had hoped. But through it all, she held on to the one thing she had learned so well over the years: persistence. In the end, the project was a success, not without its challenges, but it was completed on time, within budget, and to the satisfaction of the client. The team celebrated the achievement, but Elena felt something deeper: pride in herself, in her journey, in the woman she had become. She had led the team not by having all the answers, but by bringing people together, by showing up every day, by facing the challenges head on. It wasn't about being flawless, it was about being relentless. And in that relentless pursuit, Elena had found something even more valuable than success. She had found the strength to keep going, to keep learning, and to trust herself. As Elena stood before her team after the successful completion of the project, a part of her was still processing everything that had happened. She had led them through the toughest challenges, and they had succeeded together. It wasn't the recognition, the praise, or the final report that stood out to her most. It was the fact that, for the first time, she had truly stepped into the person she always knew she could be. But it also came with a weight she wasn't fully prepared for. Being in charge wasn't as glamorous as it had seemed from the outside. It wasn't just about having a seat at the table or making decisions. It was about carrying the responsibility for everything, about ensuring the team's cohesion, and about constantly managing expectations. There were moments when Elena found herself overwhelmed by the demands of the role. When a problem arose that required her attention, she didn't have the luxury of hesitation anymore. The weight of leadership didn't just come from solving problems, it came from being the person others looked to, the person others counted on. And for the first time, Elena felt the pressure of that responsibility. Could she continue to perform at this level? Could she keep up with the demands and challenges of the job? As time went on, Elena started to recognize something deeper in herself. The doubt, the fear of failure, it never fully went away. It wasn't something that could be erased or outgrown. Instead, she realized it was something that could be managed, something that could coexist with success. Fear wasn't the enemy. It was simply a part of the journey. Her second major project as a leader came sooner than she had expected. The ECOS stakes were higher, the expectations greater. Elena was entrusted with a high-profile client, and there was little room for error. The deadlines were tight, and the technology they were working with was untested, which added even more pressure. She had to lean on her team more than ever. But despite the challenges, Elena knew that asking for help didn't make her weak. It made her human. She had spent years proving to herself that she could handle everything alone, that she could power through it without asking anyone for assistance. But this time she recognized that leadership was about more than just solving problems alone. It was about guiding others, listening, and using the collective strengths of the team. There were moments when she thought about quitting, when the pressure became too much and the weight of responsibility felt unbearable. But each time, Eleanor reminded herself of something important. She had been here before. She had failed. She had fallen. And she had always found a way back. Failure wasn't the end of the road. It was simply part of the path. She wasn't afraid of the challenge anymore. She was afraid of what might happen if she didn't try. One late night, when the office was quieter than usual, Elena found herself sitting alone at her desk, reviewing the final details of the project. It had been a long day, one filled with problems to solve and deadlines to meet, and yet she still felt unsettled. Something wasn't right. The design wasn't clicking, the solution wasn't as clean as it could be. But instead of panicking, she took a deep breath and gave herself a moment of clarity. She picked up the phone and called one of her colleagues, a junior engineer who had been with the company for less time, but whose perspective she had always valued. They talked for hours, going through the details, brainstorming ideas. Eventually, together, they came up with a solution that worked, one that improved the system's efficiency without sacrificing performance. It wasn't a grand idea, but it was a practical one, a small improvement that made a big difference. Elena hung up the phone, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over her. It wasn't just the solution that mattered. It was the fact that she had been willing to ask for help, to acknowledge that she didn't have all the answers. It was in that moment that she realized something profound. True leadership wasn't about having every solution. It was about guiding others toward the best solutions, about building a team that trusted each other and worked together. As the project wrapped up, Elena felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just the success of the client or the praise from her superiors. It was the fact that she had done something she once thought impossible. She had grown into a leader, someone who didn't shy away from the pressure but embraced it. And in doing so, she had become someone she could respect. But even more importantly, Elena understood that she had learned how to balance responsibility with vulnerability. She had learned to trust others as much as she trusted herself. And in that, she had become not just a better engineer, but a better person. Months passed, and Elena's career continued to unfold in ways she had never imagined. The fear, the doubt, the feeling of being overwhelmed, they didn't disappear, but they became quieter. With every challenge she faced, she became more comfortable with the discomfort, more confident in her ability to rise above it. Her role as a team leader solidified, and she found herself being sought after for more complex, high-stakes projects. Yet, despite the success and the recognition, something inside her had changed in a deeper, more subtle way. She had learned that success wasn't about reaching a certain point. It wasn't a destination. It wasn't about winning awards, being praised, or making it to the top. Success was in the quiet moments, the late nights spent problem solving, the conversations where someone's idea clicked with her own, the acknowledgement of her own growth, and the realization that failure was never truly the end. One day, Elena received a letter from her old professor. the one who had taught her that first math class, the one who had given her the grade that had made her question her future. The letter was a simple note telling her how proud he was of her achievements. He didn't dwell on her past struggles. He didn't need to. He simply acknowledged the person she had become. Reading the letter, Elena felt a rush of emotions. She had come so far. The girl who had failed math so many times, the girl who had believed she wasn't good enough, had turned into a woman who led multi-million-dollar projects, who inspired others with her determination, her resilience, and her ability to navigate the complexities of engineering. But in a way, she realized that the girl who had struggled in school wasn't gone. She was still there, inside of her. She was part of the journey. She was the reason Elena had learned how to push through, how to keep going when everything seemed impossible. And she would always be part of who Elena was, an integral part of the story that had shaped her into the engineer, the leader, and the person she had become. One evening, Elena stood by her apartment window, gazing out at the city skyline. The lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of all the work still to be done, the goals still ahead. But in that moment, Elena wasn't thinking about what she hadn't yet accomplished. Instead, she was thinking about the journey she had already traveled, the lessons she had learned, and the person she had become. She had once been afraid of failure. She had once feared that she wasn't enough, but now those fears were quieter. She knew that there would always be challenges ahead, more projects, more obstacles, more moments of self-doubt. But she also knew that she could face them. She could handle them, because she had learned time and time again that success wasn't about being flawless. It was about continuing to move forward no matter what. Her story was far from over. There was so much more to learn, so much more to do. But Elena understood now that she didn't need to have it all figured out. She didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to keep going, to keep pushing herself, to keep embracing every challenge along the way. Because in the end, it wasn't the destination that mattered. It was the journey. And Elena was living proof that even the longest, hardest journeys could lead to places beyond what anyone ever imagined. It wasn't long before Elena's accomplishments reached further than she had ever anticipated. She started to receive invitations to speak at conferences, to participate in panels, and to mentor younger engineers. People from all over the industry began to take notice of her story, of her struggles, her growth, and her relentless pursuit of improvement. But for Elena, each new milestone felt like a reminder of how far she had come, not a declaration of her success. She didn't view herself as a role model, not in the traditional sense. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't always confident. She still had moments of uncertainty and self-doubt. But what she had learned through years of persistence and struggle was the power of perseverance. It wasn't about having all the answers or even about being at the top of her field. It was about constantly pushing forward, no matter how. Many times she stumbled along the way. Elena's first speaking engagement at a large tech conference was a defining moment. Standing in front of a packed auditorium, she was introduced as a rising star in engineering, a leader in her field. But as she stepped onto the stage, her heart raced with the same nerves she had felt when she first started out. She wasn't prepared for this moment. She had no speech written, no carefully planned out words to say. All she had was her story, the story of the girl who had struggled in math, the story of the engineer who had never believed she could lead a team. As she began speaking, Elena found herself sharing the journey she had taken, from her struggles in school to her moments of doubt, to the lessons she had learned along the way. She didn't try to hide the hard parts. She didn't try to make her journey seem easy or flawless. Instead, she talked about the value of persistence, of learning from failures, and of finding strength in vulnerability. She spoke about the importance of asking for help and of the necessity of trusting in one's own growth. The audience listened intently. By the time she finished, Elena realized something. It wasn't the technical knowledge, the impressive achievements, or the titles that mattered most. It was the authenticity. It was her willingness to be vulnerable, to admit her mistakes, and to show that the road to success was rarely straight and smooth. People didn't need perfection. They needed the real story, the one that spoke to the struggles and triumphs we all faced. The applause that followed was warm, sincere. Elena felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond her career achievements. It wasn't the accolades or the recognition that made this moment special. It was the fact that she had shared her truth, and in doing so, had connected with others in a way that mattered. After the talk, a young engineer approached Elena. She was shy, clearly nervous, but her words were full of admiration. "I've been struggling with math," she said. "I keep failing, and I feel like maybe I'm just not cut out for this. But hearing your story, it gives me hope. Maybe I can keep going." Elena smiled, feeling a lump form in her throat. The girl's words resonated deeply with her. This was why she had shared her story. Not for the recognition or the applause, but to show others that it was okay to struggle. It was okay to fail. It was part of the process. It was part of becoming. "Who you are meant to be, I promise you," Elena said gently. "I've been there. I know exactly how you feel. But what I've learned is that failure is just a part of the journey. The key is to never stop trying." As the girl walked away, Elena stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the conversation sink in. She had once been that girl, unsure, frustrated, ready to give up. But now, she was standing at the front of the room offering a message of hope. She realized that the true value of her journey wasn't just in her success. It was in her ability to inspire others to keep going, even when the road seemed impossible. For the first time in a long while, Elena allowed herself to feel proud, not of her accomplishments, but of the person she had become. The girl who had failed, who had been afraid, who had doubted herself, had turned into someone who could guide others through their own struggles. She wasn't perfect, and she didn't have all the answers. But she had learned one important thing. The only way forward was to keep moving. And she would keep moving, for as long as she could. Elena's journey was no longer just about her personal growth. She had moved beyond the point where she only cared about proving herself. Now it was about what she could give to others. She had spent so many years chasing success, afraid of what would happen if she stopped to reflect. And now, at this point in her career, she realized that success was never truly the end game. It was the byproduct of a deeper purpose. As the years passed, Elena's role in the company expanded. She was no longer simply a project manager or a leader of engineering teams. She was starting to shape the vision for the company itself. She was brought in to work on innovative products, new technologies that pushed the boundaries of what had once seemed impossible. And as much as she was proud of what she had accomplished, there was a part of her that still felt like she was on the edge of something greater. One evening, after a long day spent brainstorming with a team of engineers, Elena found herself at a crossroads. They were working on a complex, cutting-edge technology, a machine that had the potential to revolutionize their field. But there were huge risks involved. The project was over budget, the technology was untested, and the timeline seemed impossibly tight. There was a constant undercurrent of doubt. Was it worth the risk? Her team came to her for guidance. They wanted to know what she thought, whether they should push forward despite the uncertainty, or if they should scale back and take a safer route. Elena stood